Hey everyone, so today we're gonna do my February wrap up, and as we all know, February is Black History Month, or was Black History Month, so I made it a point to read all Black authors featuring all Black characters. Let's just get started. So, most of the books, since I read them like a month ago at this point, I do not have any longer because I checked them out from the library, or I got them on Audible or like an ebook. And the first book was Pet by Akwaeke Emezi, and Pet was a like speculative fiction kind of not dystopian, but like science fiction future version of the world that like we live in which there's been a revolution and now there's no longer like racism and abuse and cops and prisons. However, there is like a new monster possibly on the loose, and it comes alive in a painting that the main character sort of discovers, and it's about her journey throughout her community and trying to figure out what the monster is, and kind of an exploration of the themes and ideas of like what makes society better and how do we build it and how do we maintain it. And I think it was a really wonderful story. I think I gave it 5 stars. Next book that I read was The Bluest Eye by, oh wait, I'm holding it upside down, was The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. This was a phenomenal read. This is the first Toni Morrison book I've ever read, and the first book that she wrote. And it's sort of like a series of vignettes of a couple different people and families within this like small town in Ohio, I believe. And it's really, I don't know, it's very dark and gritty, but the characters are so richly developed, and there's this like magical kind of feeling and immersion of her use of language and narrative and storytelling. It's just so magical, and in like a dark way, if that makes sense, but it's so beautiful still. Anyway, it was a pretty short book actually, and like a pretty quick read. Would highly recommend if you're just starting out with Morrison's work. Truly incredible. 5 out of 5 stars. Oh, also, I forgot to mention, February was a very good reading month for me. I don't think I rated any book less than 4 stars, but also like I'm the kind of person who loves every book I read, because if I don't like it, I will typically just like stop reading it. Okay, so the next book that I read, or rather listened to on Audible, was On the Come Up by Angie Thomas. Kat from Papercut Dreams recommended this audiobook, and I would have to second that recommendation. It was really, really good. Unpopular opinion, but I didn't really get into The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas, which everyone was raving about like a couple years ago, but On the Come Up was like, it really blew me away, and I kind of saw the hype that everyone had for Angie Thomas, because she really does write these family dynamics and characters in such a like great way, like in a way that makes them feel familiar, like characters that you've been following on a TV show for several seasons. Like that degree of closeness, I guess. This book, I'm sure you already heard about it, is about a teenager in, oh my god, what city does she live in? I don't remember. But this teenager who wants to be a rapper, and is kind of forced in a position where she feels that that's her only way out of both the projects and her and her family's dire situation, and she's very close with her aunt, who is also very into hip-hop and wants to, manage her career, but she's also involved in some local, like, gang affiliations or gang activity in her neighborhood and in her area, and the main character also goes to, like, a predominantly white school in a more affluent part of town. There's a really good, I think, discussion about race and the systemic inequality that is all tied together in this really unique narrative voiced by, like, a 16-year-old girl who is really quite funny and clever, and I really like the main character, and all of the characters. I mean, well, most of them, really. So yeah, I think I gave that 5 stars as well. The next book that I read was The Deep by Rivers Solomon. This book really blew me away. It was another sort of speculative fiction, sci-fi, but fantasy more, because the premise of this story, like, blew me away and grabbed my attention the first time I ever heard about it, so I knew I had to read it this month. Basically, it's about this, like, society, well, it's not the setting is, and, like, the premise is that there's a society of, like, mer people who live in the deep, hence the title, who are actually the descendants of enslaved African women who were thrown overboard when they were pregnant and who had died or who had been dead, and their offspring was birthed post the death of the mother, but the offspring came out as, like, half fish, half human, and able to survive in the water. So basically there's, like, a whole society of mer people who are descendants of enslaved women who were thrown overboard during the Middle Passage and the transatlantic slave trade. But the thing is that, like, the memories and the trauma of knowing their history and the brutality of humans and slavery is, like, too much for the average, like, mer person to, like, hold on to and be able to carry with them every day within their day-to-day lives. So what they have instead in this structured society is they have one historian who carries and lives through all of these memories at all times, and every, like, mating cycle or so there's a remembrance ceremony where everyone collectively experiences that history and that trauma to remember who they are as a people and where they came from. And that, when I heard that premise, I was like, I need to read this, because it follows the main character, who is a historian but feels like she cannot handle the task, and it's, like, kind of about her experiences within the community and her, like, her attempted escape from it, and it explores, like, really complex themes about, community and history and remembrance, trauma and collective trauma. Rivers Solomon, who is a non-binary author, by the way, if you're looking for non-binary authors to read in particular. The next book that I read was actually not a book, it's a play called A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry. It's, like, an American classic in terms of plays and theater, and it's a very small, like, small work of literature, so it wasn't that hard to get through, but it basically, I kind of went into this play not really knowing much about it, except the fact that it was, like, a great American play. It's, like, considered a great American play, but I didn't know, like, much beyond that. So, and I honestly think I really enjoyed the story in that way, but I guess a quick rundown of the premise is that there is a Black family in, I think, Chicago. I'm so bad about remembering names, like, specific names and places of books I read, even though, like, I remember the plots and the themes and stuff. But anyway, they are struggling, but I think like the grandpa dies or something, so they're about to get a huge life insurance check that can ensure that they can like finally buy a house and get a better life. But, you know, a couple things step in their way. The thing that starts with R and ends with acism. Obviously a very sad story, but it's also hopeful, and I think it's really good examination of like the role of the patriarch and kind of mental health and like the kind of stages of identities that people within a nuclear family structure kind of goes through. Like there's the old and wise grandmother, and then there's the worried mother, and then there's the, you know, wanting to explore the world daughter, and there's the father who feels like he who wishes he had more out of life. Yeah, it was just, I think, a wonderful exploration of family and identity. So the next book I read was Monday's Not Coming by Tiffany D. Jackson. And I actually read this for a book club with a couple of my friends, which didn't really go as we planned, but I still had a good time reading it. It's basically about a girl who goes missing, and the only person who really notices is her best friend. And this is set during like when they're like in 8th grade-ish, like between when they're like it kind of jumps. It's not in chronological order, so it jumps around in terms of the time period, but they kind of are in like middle school and maybe beginning of high school for the entirety of the book. Oh, so I lied when I said everything was 4 stars and above. I gave this particular book 3 stars because, to be honest, I felt like because the ages of the main characters were kind of like skewed to the younger side, the tone was kind of juvenile and the perspectives were as well. And since we were limited to the main character's perspective, a lot of the time, like, we didn't really get the full story or the full picture. And it was till like later on in the book, and it was kind of frustrating to be stuck in the mind of like a 12-year-old, you know? I think if you read more middle grade, you would really enjoy this book because like about 2/3 of the way in, I started getting really invested. Like I could not put this down because not like mystery, but a little bit of that and a little bit of like thrill kind of came in, and I just was like, oh, what happens? And there's a twist at the end that I was like, oh my gosh. And it was a pretty long book, but the like words and the text were pretty big in terms of font size. The last book I read in February was the audiobook of River Solomon's other book, or I guess their debut novel, which is called An Unkindness of Ghosts. Oh, by the way, I read The Deep by River Solomon also via audiobook. Okay, so in An Unkindness of Ghosts, the premise of this book also got me right away. Basically, I'm very excited to see whatever River Solomon has up next for us, because the world that they build and the characters that they build and like these settings that they create just like kind of blow my mind. An Unkindness of Ghosts is set in a futuristic world where humanity has evacuated Earth after some sort of like climate crisis, I suppose, and now we live in space in a giant ship called the Matilda. And on the Matilda, there are upper levels and lower levels. And it's, you know, obviously like a symbol of class structure and positioning. And of course, all of the Black people live on the bottom and are basically enslaved. Like Cindy Pham from Read with Cindy kind of described it as like the placing of the antebellum South in the far future in like a space setting. And I think in some ways like that's true, but more than that, I think it's not just like antebellum South kind of setting. It's like more of a like fascist, authoritarian, like right-wing religious state that is kind of imposed onto the whole ship, which then creates like class structures and racial structures that are kind of a heightened version of the realities of today. And there's also like a very interesting exploration of like language, because different parts of the ship speaks different kinds of like dialects, and like your dialect kind of also gives away as a part of your class positioning, as is true in the real world. And basically, beyond the premise and stuff and the interesting details and tidbits that my mind gets stuck in, is that we follow a main character who is autistic and kind of genderqueer in some ways, and her trying to find more, her search for more information about her mother and her history. Like, she's kind of just searching for her history because her mother, she thinks, killed herself when she was a baby, and she is very intelligent, like out of this world smart, out of this world, get it? Because they're in space. But she's like very scientifically minded and has her own lab, and basically the start of the story starts off when there's a kind of blackout in the lower levels. There's no power or electricity, so it's very cold and people are dying. So it's kind of about this main character's, her name's Aster. Once again, forgetting main characters' names. Aster's kind of journey in trying to find her mom and save her people. And there's another character that there's like kind of a love interest thing going on. It's like the relationship is important to the entire narrative of the story. They work together in some ways to, you know, I don't know, just read the book. You'll see. I rated it 5 stars. It's phenomenal. Blew my mind. The world, the characters, the relationships were all so... I think River Solomon, another thing about their writing that's kind of reflected in this is more of that exploration of like trauma and history and the importance of remembering. Yeah, that was the last book I read in February for Black History Month. Let me know what you read this month if you feel like it. My Goodreads is linked down below. And give me recommendations for what else you think I should read. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.